So let me introduce our panelists, starting with Marco Buti. Marco Buti has done his undergraduate course, is a graduate from University of Florence. He's done postgraduate studies at University of Oxford, and he's got a long career in the European Commission. He's currently Director General of the Economic and Financial Affairs, the DG ECFIN, very well known DG ECFIN. In spite of his long career in European institutions, in European Commission, he's got time to write books, and I would like to mention one of his books published in 2003, which is Fiscal and Monetary Policies in EMU, Interactions and Coordination. Quite a very premonition at that time. Next panelist, Catherine de Vries. She's a professor of political science at Bocconi, but also affiliated professor at the Free University of Amsterdam and associate member of Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. She held previously teaching positions all over the world. She has a PhD in political science. She has a long list of publications in leading economic journals, and namely focusing on democratic politics, the risks of challenger parties in Europe, corruption, public perceptions about European integration, among others. A next panelist, Daniel Gros, holds a PhD in economics from University of Chicago. He's a member of the board and distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. He was a director of the CEPS for 20 years. He's worked at the IMF, at the European Commission as economic advisor to the Delors Committee that developed the plans for the euro. He's a high-level advisor. He's advisor at several advisory bodies to French and Belgian governments, and provided advice to numerous central banks and governments. He's currently also advisor to the European Parliament, and was also a member of the Advisory Scientific Council of the European Systemic Risk Board. He was also visiting professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Next panelist, Oren Doyle. He's got a PhD from Trinity College, Dublin, in law. He's a professor in law at the Trinity College. He's got visiting positions all over the world, including Japan and Taiwan. He's got publications, namely in comparative constitutional law and participatory democracy. He's got wide research interests, namely on the unification referendums on the island of Ireland. Last but not the least, Francesco Papadia has got a degree in law, postgraduate studies in economics, is currently senior resident fellow of Bruegel, chair of prime collateralized securities, and chair of the selection panel of the Hellenic Financial Stability Fund. He's also lecturing at the University of Rome, Louis. Francesco Papadia has most of his career as a central banker, which was culminated by his appointment as Director General of Monetary Operations of the ECB, a position he held between 1998 and 2012. when he became, for a while, advisor to the executive board of the ECB. He has a long career in central banking and recently published a book on central banking in turbulent times. So after this very brief introduction of this distinguished panel we have, without any further ado, let us start the session with the first question to Marco. April the 30th was the deadline for submitting spending plans with accompanying promises on economic reform for the next generation EU. European countries have presented their plans for scrutiny by the European Commission. The process of analyzing the 27 sets of proposals will take about 2 months. And then national governments will have another month to pass judgment on their peers. It could be late in the summer before the money can be distributed and spent. So could you please give us an update on the process and some more detail on when you expect the funding to start flowing through the European countries?
Well, thank you very much, Nuno. First of all, I have to correct you because in describing my CV, you stopped 1 life ago. So since the beginning of this college, I'm Chief of Staff for Commissioner for the Economy Gentiloni. So this gives me a 1-minute bonus for my intervention, either on the first or on the second session. So going to your question, indeed, 30th of April was the indicative date. It was not an absolute deadline. We received 12 plans by then, and plans have continued to flow in, and we have received so far 23 plans. So, and the rest will come in the next weeks. And we are, I mean, this seminar actually takes place the very week action starts in earnest. Because what we are going to have is that as of tomorrow, there will be the first adoption by the Commission of the plans through what is called in legal terms, Council Implementing Decision. So after basically the 8 weeks that are allowed in the regulation for the examination of the programs. And let's say even more timely, today, the Commission goes on the market for raising the funds for next generation EU, so the first issuance. So stay tuned because at 6 o'clock, between 6 and 6:30, there will be the announcement of the results. You can expect very good news, actually, showing that the demand from Europe is there, and this time around the supply as well. What is happening now? As of tomorrow, there will be the first adoptions of the plans, and they will continue in the next weeks in a rather, with a rather constant flow, continuous flow over the next days. Then the Council has 4 weeks, as you recall, for the final adoption, and then we can start with a 13% pre-financing, which will be issued in the first installment, let's say by the end of July, to the member states. We go on the market today, when we go on the market again in July, and then we continue to go in the markets after the summer break. So there will be, for the first installment, some pro rata assignments to the adopted programs. Now, so this is the process. On the substance, we have used not only the 8 weeks, but all the previous several months to discuss informally with the member states, so that we are not, I mean, once with the member states actually present the programs, most of the questions will have been evacuated. So in substance. So what you'll see tomorrow, I think, is a country you know well, by the way, will be adopted. The program will be adopted tomorrow. We look at how balanced the response is in the plan to the objectives of Next Generation EU, the response to the country-specific recommendations, so the coherence of that, the contributions to sustainable growth, employment, social issues, the green and the digital transition. I recall 37% minimum and 20% minimum will have to go to the double transition. The lasting impact of the program, I mean the monitoring, the governance issue. So the documents will cover all these elements here. What I would like to tell you is the following to conclude. First, I would not expect huge problems in the adoption by the Council. The Commission has done a very, very thorough job with the Member States. I think I hope that there will be, a relatively smooth handling on the part of the Council. First point. Second point, the logic of the Recovery and Resilience Facility is the inverse of those of the structural funds. So basically, we move from input to an output logic. So before, in many other programs, input logic, you spend the money, you present the invoice, the EU budget will foot the bill. Here, we are in an output logic. And in fact, key elements in the annex of the Council implementing decisions are the milestones and the targets. So the intermediate and the final objectives. This is apart from the 13% which is attributed at the moment of the adoption of the program. For the rest of the flow, you have to actually deliver, otherwise the money doesn't come. So and also with so in a very detailed manner, and second, with a chrono program which is very, very ambitious, because the regulation says that by end 22, 70% of the funds will have to be committed. At the end of 23, 100%, and the payments by 26, 27. So it is a huge, a very, very ambitious and demanding plan. And actually, I think the governance on which we have insisted a lot of the plans is something that is key, not only to deliver the plan itself, but I would say also potentially as, let's say, a permanent legacy in terms of the proper functioning of the country. So that is it's a bit what I wanted to tell you in this first round. The ball is rolling, I think rolling fast, and we are going to have a very busy summer.
Very good news indeed. Now let me go to the second question, Danielle. For a long time, a recurring criticism of the euro area is that it lacks a common central budget, like in other monetary unions. So the question is, has the COVID crisis worked as a trigger for the creation of a new instrument that could assist the long-term stability of the euro area and the European Union as a whole? Is this package large enough to be considered as a reasonable response to the current crisis?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to discuss the future of Europe, nonetheless, nothing less with you. The question you ask is actually twofold. Let us first start with the Next Generation EU program. One aspect which I find very important about it is that it is not a euro area program. It is an EU program. So the purpose was not in the first instance to save the euro area, but it was, in my view at least, to show solidarity with countries which had been hit very unevenly by a very strong shock, and the shock which really one had to say was exogenous, something which Marco has emphasized very often. There was no question of moral hazard here. This was something which just came from the outside, and for no fault of their own, some countries more exposed to tourism were hit much more. So I think it was a very welcome, concrete expression of European solidarity, not especially linked to the euro area. There were, at the very initial moment, some tensions, financial tensions within the euro area, but they were pretty much squashed immediately by the ECB. So that is the first point which I would emphasize. Whether or not we will have in future another program like the NGO, I cannot predict, but I would say it is not the cyclical stabilization instrument which many people think is necessary. It was also not meant to be cyclical stabilization. I think Marco emphasized several times that this is a program where countries are supposed to have fundamental reform projects. And we have, if you want, the recession today. The expenditure, hopefully, as Marco said, might come next year, or actually the commitments for the expenditure come over the next 2 years, and the actual expenditure later. So it's definitely, I would say at least, not an instrument of cyclical stabilization. The final question, of course, is that you alluded when you asked it, is do we need a fiscal stabilization instrument? And here, I must say, I don't see the need to say the euro area cannot survive without such an instrument. There are reasons to believe that joint cyclical fiscal policy would be useful, because if any one country does it on its own, there are external effects. So if Germany does a fiscal expansion, it has effects on other countries. But these effects very much depend on the circumstances. They can be either positive or negative, depending on the situation which you are in. A country which is very close to Germany might benefit a lot from more exports to Germany. A country which is very far from Germany, let's say Portugal, might benefit less and might be more affected by any incipient increase in ECB interest rates. Now we might be in a special situation where that doesn't hold, but that's all to be discussed. So my main point would be that whether or not we need, for the euro area as opposed to the EU, for the euro area as a common currency area, we need a common fiscal instrument is, in my view, not really proven for all circumstances. Maybe in the present circumstances of very low or close to zero interest rates, one can make the case, but I doubt that one can say that this is really absolutely needed to ensure the survival of the euro as such.
Thank you, Danielle, for your insights. Catherine, there are very important elections forthcoming in the European Union. So France and Germany are the next ones online. Now, governments like Trump, Bolsonaro, so governments that are sympathetic to the populist parties in Europe seem to have been quite not very competent in dealing with the pandemic. So the question is whether for the next round of elections, the economic impact and the management of the COVID crisis by the European governments will tend to will tend to reinforce populist movements or otherwise lead to their underperformance, so to say. What are your views on this?
Thank you very much for me also to be a part of this panel, this session. I'm just going to try to see if I can also, can you see the slides?
Yes, yes.
Exactly. So before I answer the question, I just wanted to very clearly define what populism is and what it isn't. So one of the kind of key conceptualizations is, of course, Müller, a fellow, I live in Italy, but I'm Dutch originally, a fellow Dutchman who lives in the US, who defines on the basis of 3 criteria. So a thin ideology, a notion of people versus the elite, anti-establishment, views the elite or articulates that the elite would be corrupt, and anti-pluralist. So the idea that that people are not comprised of different sections that might be of different of a diverse group, but a kind of uniform idea. So just kind of in that before we start. So of these populists, of which Donald Trump fits some of these criteria, but not maybe 100%, but nonetheless, it seemed like that. He has his picture trying to look in dealing with the pandemic, that the pandemic has been a challenge for populism. So overall, populists have underperformed. I'll show that in a minute. Populism is not necessarily the recipe for crisis management, is also not what most populists are interested in. You can also say that they've lost a little bit their mojo, so their modus of operandi, in the sense that they often thrive on anti-establishment issues, so portraying the elites as being pro-migration or letting people in that they feel does not, or they define as not being part of the public. Also anti-EU, you saw that also with changes in this country on the Lega. But you also saw internal struggles. So in some countries, you saw actually that some internal divisions, the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, but you also saw the formed democracy in the Netherlands. So you've seen some of the weakness as the success rises, or you saw in Italy that one populist party was replaced a little bit by the other in the polls, which is the Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia with Lega. So a challenge. So the interesting thing of what the pandemic originally did is it created a rally around the flag effect for governments. Note that the rally around the flag effect we see unraveling now. So ahead of the German and French elections, they might be just taking place a little bit too late. In my country, there was an election and Prime Minister Mark Rutte still benefited from that. He's now in a lot of scrutiny, but that election time, he still could have reaped this benefit. And also, interestingly, what we do here is we looked at a survey in which, in the middle of the survey period, the Italian lockdown was announced. And we looked at what that did to government support. We saw that there was no effect for far-right parties or populist parties on the far right, nothing on left-right ideology, but we saw that incumbent support in other countries increased as there was a strong signal of crisis in another country. So we know that it happened to Conte and the Prime Minister of Italy, but actually this also happened for the Prime Minister in France, Poland, Spain and Germany, and that is because of what we outline in this particular paper, because people in a term of crisis want solutions, not necessarily rhetoric, and they're very concerned about that particular solution. So that rally around the flag was there. However, then the vaccines came, and in Europe, of course, there was some issues of rollout. Ultimately, it got sorted, but it made a little dent in the governments, and you saw that already as the second wave came up. So it was not a recipe forever. So what does that mean kind of for the populists? So some of my colleagues here at Bocconi have looked at the response of populists across the globe. So we have, classifications of these parties that are in government. So, and he looks at populist governments versus other governments. They were slower in responding, and they actually also did less. So this kind of fits the idea that we have, this is from the first wave, fits of the idea that populist parties are not necessarily that interested in government overall. So the element of people seeing a crisis and wanting effective crisis response, rallying on the flag effect, and then populists actually not providing that necessarily. So we saw some of that waning. However, and I close with that, it doesn't mean that now it's kind of free for all. We saw already that as the performance becomes more clear and move out of a crisis response, the other responses are going to be discussed. So what we see already in several countries, we see investigations about the government response. It's going to maybe have an effect long term. There's been corruption scandals in some countries, including my own, a very strong corruption scandal involving one of the government parties. We saw it also of the Christian Democrats in Germany. So the question is, how will that play out? Then the other element is that other factors are going to come back on the agenda. So that is, for example, immigration. So this is a group of economists that have looked actually in New Zealand, but there have been similar analyses in Europe about shocks of immigration to labor markets. So overall shocks to immigration and then shocks to immigration to labor markets. This has been work done on Brexit, that in areas where those shocks were particularly felt, we saw a move towards, this is voting for New Zealand first. This is from the 1990s, but we saw similarly analysis for Brexit. So immigration and these kind of areas provide a breeding ground for populists. So as we see, for example, in a country like Spain, immigration from Morocco moving up, we see also Vox, the populist right party, moving up in the polls. And the other element is, this is work by colleagues of mine at Bocconi, working on the economic roots of populism. So when there are shocks to unemployment or when there are financial crises, that often this is a breeding ground for populists as well. So it'd be a very interesting period to kind of round that off. It's not been easy for populists, but on the other hand, if there is a time in which economic uncertainty rises again and immigration becomes part and parcel of the agenda, especially economic uncertainty as we take off these support mechanisms or short-term generous work support or unemployment support benefits in the context of the crisis, that maybe we see a kind of a breeding ground developing again for populists. So just to end, I think before the crisis, too many commentators were saying that populists were going to take over most of the governments across the globe. That was an exaggeration, but now to think that in the crisis, populism is on the retreat, I think is another exaggeration. So hopefully that answered your question.
Very good, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. A little bit of more good news, I would say. Francesco, your turn. The European Union handled the sovereign debt crisis and the COVID crisis very differently. This is a topic Danielle has already referred to. The question is whether the difference in the response to the crisis has contributed to strengthening the support to the European unification, and what could be the justification for this change in the reaction to the crisis, to the two different crises.
Well, thank you very much, Nuno. It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope you can see. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
I think that also listening to Marco, I think the COVID crisis is another case in which Monet's prophecy was made true, in the sense that Europe progresses by the accumulation of answers to a recurrent crisis. So that's a good news. But over the 70 years of European unification, there are two fundamental questions that loom in the background, which are a source of anxiety for the supporters of the endeavor, and I consider a fateful weakness for opponents of the European Union. And the two questions are, first, whether ever deeper economic integration in Europe is sufficiently accompanied by more effective policy action. In a way, one could say, is Marco and his colleagues' action enough to guide the European economy? The second question is whether policy action at European level is based on strong democratic foundations. Sometimes this goes under the name of demos. Is there a European demos that can give effective basis, democratic basis to the action policy level in Europe. Now, I think that torrents of words have been dedicated to address these two questions. But with three colleagues at Bruegel, we decided that the questions were too important to be left without an attempt to give quantitative evidence about them. And so this is what we have done in a series of papers that are published on the Bruegel website. Now, the first piece of evidence, which I don't report a chart here because it's well known, is that in the last half century, trade integration in Europe has increased by a factor of 3. Remember this number. 3 is the factor by which trade integration has increased in Europe, and we take this as a proxy of economic integration. But the integration of public action, which we measure as a ratio between European and national public employees, has increased even more, has increased by a factor of 8, as you see in the chart. The share of European public employees is very small with respect to the total number of public employees in Europe, but it has increased in the last 50 years by a factor of 8, which of course is much higher than trade integration. But the question is whether this is supported, as I said, by a European demos. And in this chart, you have some evidence about this. This is relative turnout at elections for the European Parliament relative to elections, national elections. And you see that this is on average lower, in some cases much lower than for national elections. So the turnout at the European Parliament is lower than for national elections. That it has been decreasing for quite a few decades, and only in the last couple of decades it has grown. And still at the end of the period, relative turnout at European Parliament election is about 80% of the average turnout at the national election. So mixed evidence about this European demos. Here you have another source of information. This chart reports the frequency of European news with respect to total news in 3 newspapers, Le Monde, La Stampa, and Der Spiegel. And you see that there has been an increase, especially over the last 2 to 3 decades. And overall, here there's time series started just after World War II. The frequency of European news has increased by a factor of 4 for Le Monde, 5 for La Stampa, and 6 for Der Spiegel. So if you remember the 8, which was the factor by which policy action at European level has increased, this is quite less than the integration of policy action. So again, yes, there has been an increase, but no, the increase has not matched the increase of policy action. So what are the conclusions one can draw from this quantitative evidence by which we try to complement the qualitative arguments that are put forward about the 2 questions that I put forward at the end? The first conclusion is that policy and administrative integration at European level grew even beyond economic integration. So the fear that the balance between the public and the private sector has changed in a negative direction because of trade integration progressing more than policy and administrative integration, this fear is not justified by our quantitative evidence. However, the fact remains that the interest of citizens in Europe, while growing, especially since the introduction of the euro, has not kept pace with economic and policy integration. So it seems that this European demos is there, but is probably not strong enough to conclude that there is no technocratic character for the Union. So on one question, our conclusions are pretty definite and positive. On the other one, they're quite mixed. There is still an issue of a fledgling and not sufficiently developed demos. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Very, very nice presentation. The last question on this round to Oran. So, Oran, 6 months after Brexit, news coming from the United Kingdom show queues of delivery trucks trying to cross the channel between Britain and France. They show blockades of fishing boats, little fishing wharves outside Jersey ports, and then even the temporary imprisonment and deportation of European citizens from the UK. So it shows that a little bit a bumpy process after the Brexit. So please give us a view or your view on what are the political, economic, and social implications for Europe going forward of Brexit.
Sure, so thanks for the question. I suppose in many ways, Brexit is progressing as you'd expect when a country, a member state, leaves the European Union. Trade between the UK and the EU is down. Businesses are encountering difficulties. Individuals are facing difficulties moving between the UK and the European Union. You referred to it as a bumpy process. I think probably some of those bumps are subsiding or being ironed out. But on the other hand, these problems are likely to intensify in another sense when the UK starts enforcing import controls and when more people start trying to move around Europe as COVID restrictions hopefully are relaxed. This will cause economic hardship and personal hardship, but in a sense that was the plan. This was the purpose of Brexit, was to make it more difficult for trade between Europe and the UK and for people to move between Europe and the UK. So that's not unexpected, I think. I think the more difficult question and the important one to grapple with is what sort of relationship is developing between the EU and the UK post-Brexit, because it seems to be becoming a relationship of acrimony and distrust, particularly focused on Northern Ireland. So many of the most difficult issues in the Brexit process were about how to deal with Northern Ireland, and post-Brexit, that's where we see the most difficult issues emerging again. So I just want to talk a little bit about that in my response. I'm sure the people on the webinar will all recall the famous Brexit Trilemma. So the UK had 3 objectives that it wanted to respect: to remove the UK from the single market and the customs union, to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and to avoid a hard border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And Theresa May, the point is that you cannot have those 3 at the same time. You can only have 2 of them. Theresa May compromised by, in effect, keeping the UK very closely aligned to the customs union and single market, but couldn't get that through Parliament. And then Boris Johnson compromised in a different direction by accepting a border in the Irish Sea, in effect, in the form, ultimately, of what is now the Northern Ireland Protocol. So Northern Ireland remains effectively in the EU customs area and has to align itself with a large portion of single market instruments, particularly around manufacture of goods, manufacture of products, agricultural goods, etc. The protocol has a lot of institutional architecture designed to make it work. I mean, they knew it was going to be bumpy. They built in lots of powers to make adjustments, find flexibilities, try to make things work better. But there is now a fundamental problem of trust around the implementation of the protocol. In September 2020, the UK government proposed legislation that would allow them to breach the protocol as a matter of national law, subsequently withdrawn that legislation, the bill. But since then, there's been a more subtle, perhaps insidious approach of unilaterally extending grace periods. So this happened in relation to agri-food. The EU had agreed a 3-month extension until the end of March. The UK unilaterally extended that for a further 6 months. And there's likely now to be a further unilateral extension in relation to chilled meat products moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland to allow the continued flow from Great Britain. So what is going on with this? I think this is the fundamental question that the EU needs to grapple with. It seems to me implausible that we could say that the UK is trying to work the protocol. If they were trying to work the protocol, there would be more active engagement in trying to find solutions to problems rather than criticisms of the protocol itself and unilateral actions. So I think there's 3 possibilities, I think all of which are probably true to some extent. The first is that the UK government is trying to foment strife in Northern Ireland in order to lead to renegotiation and softening of the protocol. Second possibility is they're trying to foment strife in Northern Ireland in order to destroy the protocol and have it replaced with something else. And the third possibility is more they're trying to manufacture grievance against the European Union for party political reasons within Great Britain. I suspect that it's all 3, that the UK government hasn't decided whether it would prefer to renegotiate the protocol or get rid of it entirely. And while that plays out, they're happy enough to benefit from the sense of EU grievance against the EU that the protocol handily provides for domestic political consumption. This obviously comes at a cost to the UK's international reputation. But it's a plausible strategy because the EU itself and Ireland, as a member of the EU, are in a weak position because there was always another solution to the Brexit Trilemma, which was to impose a border between Ireland and the rest of the EU. Now, the overriding policy objective for the Dublin government has always been to avoid having to make that choice. The EU supported Ireland very strongly through the Brexit process to make clear that that was not a choice that would be contemplated. But from the UK government's perspective, if the protocol just falls apart, ultimately that's the choice that would be faced. How would the EU single market be protected? Would it be protected by a border on the island of Ireland or between Ireland and the rest of the EU? The challenge for the EU, I suppose, is how to make sure that we don't get to that point. How does that choice not get put on the table? And how should the EU act in light of the ambiguity in the UK position? And it seems to me that what they're doing is probably broadly the correct approach of continuing to operate in the joint committee around the protocol in an attempt to find solutions for the practical problems that do exist, to continue to take enforcement proceedings both through the European Court of Justice mechanism and the arbitration mechanism, where they believe that there have been breaches of the protocol by the United Kingdom, and also ultimately be prepared to take the safeguard measures envisaged under the protocol and the trade and cooperation agreement. That would ultimately precipitate, presumably, some form of trade war between the EU and the UK. Nobody wants to go there, but unless the EU and Ireland are willing to go there, I think there is a real risk that the protocol will disintegrate and we'll be left with that choice of where the external goods border for the European Union has to go. So those are my thoughts on it for now, and there'll be a few more things I can come back to in the second round.
We'll come back to that, the second round. Thank you very much for your intervention. Before we switch to the second round, would you like to comment on each other's statements? Marco, would you have something to say about the European demos alluded to by Francesco or Catherine? How would you react to it?
Okay, no, thank you very much. No, first of all, I appreciate all the interventions. I mean, I think great insights. It would be nice to put them in a mixer and come out with a overall a view, very complementary view. Now, I would like to have maybe a couple of things. First of all, on Daniel. Daniel, okay, in my very, very long experience in European matters, I have drawn one very firm conclusion. In Europe, to go from A till B, the shortest distance is never a straight line. So when you say that this next generation EU is for the EU, not for the euro area, you're absolutely right. And actually, I draw an even stronger conclusion, is that if you try to travel from A till B on a straight line, you will never get to B. So these are my fundamental propositions. So that's why we did next generation EU. There has been a lot of discussions on euro area budget. Now, is euro area budget essential for a central stabilization budget, essential for the survival? Probably not. Is it very important for a proper functioning of the Eurozone? I would say yes. So it is something a bit more than a nice to have. On Catherine and Francesco. On Catherine, very nice slides, very insightful. I mean, for the economists, there is we all know the Gresham law. So bad money drives out good money. I think for populism, it is a sort of inverse Gresham law. So basically, real crisis drives out fake crisis. So when the real crisis with the pandemic, all these other things which are very important, but not as a crisis, existential crisis, actually they were put on the downside and put aside for them. Not necessarily they will not come back, but I think that is the thing. Now, finally, on the Monet's prophecy by Francesco, I've written a paper a couple of weeks ago, actually with George Papakonstantinou. So he's a former finance minister of Greece. So it means we have traveled a long time. You know? So former DG of ECFIN with the former finance minister of Greece. Time has changed. We put forward there what we call the Monet compatibility test. And the Monet compatibility test has actually 3 coherences that will have to be respected. One is economic coherence, the second one is institutional coherence, and the third one is the political coherence. And actually, what you do in your presentation, you underpin some of these coherences. I think the conclusion of that paper was that the response to the COVID crisis, unlike the response to the financial crisis, is more likely to respect the Monet compatibility test in terms of economic adequacy, in terms of institutional adequacy also. I mean, we did something at the central level, whilst we did not do so during the financial crisis, and so also in terms of political coherence. I mean, if you look at you don't have it, Francesco, but if you look at the surveys, Eurobarometer and others, actually the political support for the action of the EU is actually pretty strong, even in the so-called frugal countries. So I think the political support, also due to the type of crisis Daniel mentioned, is actually pretty strong. So I think that you provide a bit of evidence that this time we may be on the right path.
Thank you very much, Marco. That was an extremely good Moulinex way of combining different interventions. Unfortunately, time is running fast, and I would have to. Yes,
Francesco has raised his hand. So I'd like probably.
Oh yes, sorry, Francesco. Of course, please go ahead.
Now, of course, if there is time, if there is no time, to Marco, yes, we look at Eurobarometer, but the question we try to answer is not whether there is support, whether there is understanding, which is a different thing. So we think that the populist that Catherine illustrated have done a lot to make Europe more visible. So they would deserve the Charlemagne Prize for what they've done in terms of making Europe more known to the public. So yes, in our papers, we also look at Eurobarometers. I didn't put it there now because of time. Very shortly, I would have one question for Marco, one for Daniel, and one for Catherine. The question for Marco is, Next Generation EU works in two ways. One is a sheer weight of resources that are invested. The other one is the accompanying reforms. What is your weight? Let me tell you, my weight, I put more weight on the reforms than on the money. Especially for countries like Italy. But I would be interested in your view. The question for Daniel, I mean, Daniel is German, I'm Italian, so I think I can make this point. You say the hit was completely exogenous and it touched different countries in a different way. Yes, but some countries had some responsibilities because they were vulnerable. They came to the crisis in difficult conditions. I mean, Italy, 120, 130% debt makes you vulnerable. And so, yes, Italy has more tourism, but it was not only that, it was also the pre-existing conditions. So there was some kind of moral hazard. The question to Oren, is it really conceivable that there would be a border between the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the European Union? I don't see that. I think that this is very unlikely. And then my last question for Catherine. You talked about the populists. You didn't talk about the non-populist. I mean, what the non-populist responsibilities or role or good things that they did are. Just the populists move things around or also the non-populist? Thank you.
Catherine, would you like to answer to that challenge?
Sure, it also relates actually to another question that I can do it also in that way if I refer to that, if that's easier for you.
Yes, I think we are connecting. The questions are so nicely interacting
Perfect.
with the questions I wanted to ask that I think we let the flow go now.
Perfect. Perfect. No, so I think it's really a great question. So the way that we've often conceived of populist parties is what we refer to in a book with a co-author, Sarah Hobart at the LSE, as political entrepreneurs. So as those that want to disrupt existing forms of competition. And I think then especially about the kind of policies or the ideas that we're competing about and the rhetoric that we use in order to compete about those things. And what you often have seen in many countries is that non-populists, so we call them dominant players in the system, so just as is a market, are responding often to that disruption of political entrepreneurs. So think of Microsoft, having to respond to kind of the startup of Apple at the time, or Ford having to deal with Tesla, if you will, right? And I think that what they then often do is just focus very much on competence, which helps them in the crisis. We're better managers, right? But oftentimes what you don't see is that they reinvent themselves ideologically. So you've seen that in some countries. So you've seen in some countries like Greece, for example, that the challengers basically replaced the old. So Syriza replaced PASOK, as an example. You see in other countries that basically it becomes huge fragmentation. Italy's seen that, but the country that I'm from, the Netherlands, that's especially an example. And then you see only a couple of countries where there's a reinvention of the kind of existing parties. And actually, Oran, in that way, it's interesting that actually the Boris Johnson and the Tory party in Britain is an example of that. He's realigned his coalition over Brexit. I think also making the EU part and partial of punching every time to create a kind of culture war internally within his country. And I do think that we have to be a bit wary of that. So you see Sebastian Kurz trying to do the same thing in Austria. We've seen that, of course, also of government parties that have turned, or populists that have turned government. Orban, Kaczynski and his parties to some extent. So I do think that the EU, yeah, we can say, okay, Brexit is that, but I think there's something to be learned for exactly the reasons that Oren outlined, is the sense that some parties, so some, let's say, more conservative right parties seem to strive by using the EU as some punch ball. And I see that also very much in my own country. So just Marco, I think, like, not that I don't expect anything in the council, but the discussion about the recovery fund was a very different one in the Netherlands than it was in Italy. And it was really a replay of 2010. I mean, it was exactly the same arguments, exactly the same. And I saw a really stark difference. And this level of internalized, let's say, domesticized Euroscepticism in order to win an election, in the same way that Boris Johnson is taking that to the extreme, you do see that in some other governments as well, where they're cooperating in Brussels and not really defending those cooperations and policy solutions at home. And I think that will carry through a little bit longer. So I've kind of answered a more general element to this question and to what Francesco was asking.
Danielle, would you like to answer Francesco and connecting your answer to also how you see the exit strategy, namely the exit for the ECB exit strategy from the purchase program, the PEP or PEP. Daniel, please.
I leave the ECB to Francesco. I'm afraid they don't have an exit. They are stuck. Let me just add a few comments to what I think Catherine just said. In Germany, the discussion about the next generation EU was very different, totally different from 2008-9. It has become part of whatever, conventional wisdom, right? The day after it was announced, was basically no opposition, right? The usual fiscal hawks were nowhere to be seen, right? So, and I think that is a very good sign. There's of course one party, the AfD, but it doesn't capture the attention. The Greek crisis captured the attention of, let's say, the German savers. But this one here is okay. Some European solidarity. Let's next one, please. Right. This is I think a very important point, and for me very important as a backdrop to the solidity of this endeavor. Of course, it comes back to Francesco's question and Marco's answer later. It has to be made a success, and I totally agree with the presupposition of Francesco that the reforms are more important than the money. Let me just add one point as an economist. Money is fungible, right? So Italy spends, let's say, 900 public spending, around 900 billion euros every year. It gets from the EU in terms of transfers, not loans. Let's say around 30 billion over 2 years, right? 3 years per year. So that's roughly 4% of its overall fiscal governmental expenditure. If you can increase the productivity of the overall sum just a little bit, right? Then you might as well waste the 30 billion. That's not so important. What's really important is, I think, the overall reforms, which also have, of course, a bearing on the way the sums are being spent. And the final point, the point which only Francesco could say and I could not, is that, of course, when you have a very high debt level and you get into a crisis, you're vulnerable, right? You need help from the others. And the question, therefore, is what do we do once we have the crisis behind us? Was the idea behind the fiscal rules that over the long term you should aim to have low public debt levels? Was that such a bad idea? Bad idea. We can discuss the 3 and the 60%. But should we not come back to something which some people might call austerity, namely a policy which tends to reduce debt to GDP level, especially for those countries which start with, I don't know, 150 plus. And I think that is a discussion which we need. And my prayer would be that this particular episode has shown that technically speaking, the distribution of shocks has fat tails. From time to time, more often perhaps than we thought, we get very strong negative shocks. And to have at that point in time a low debt level is very important. And therefore, I would say, in this sense, the overall thrust of the EU's fiscal rule has been vindicated. The detail, how it's to be applied and to whom, that is to be discussed. But this is one of the lessons learned, which I would put on the table.
Thank you, Danielle. Francesco, would you pick on Danielle's remarks and comment on the exit strategy of the ECB, in particular, taking into account the following. Long-term interest rates are extremely low at the moment, extremely low. And that allows much easier the maintenance of higher public debt levels. And given the long-term the long-term nature of borrowing, it allows a significant reduction in the interest costs of debt. But that could be an accusation that the ECB is doing fiscal policy. So how on the one hand would the ECB respond to that accusation, and on the other hand allow a smooth transition without disrupting the financial stability implications of the high sovereign debt that we are inheriting from the crisis, of course.
Now, I think Daniel put it well. It's not clear what the exit strategy of the ECB is. I don't know whether we will know a bit more when they will publish their strategy review, which is supposed to come towards the end, towards the autumn. For the time being, what they seem worried to say is we are not exiting, we are not exiting, we are not exiting, which is a message that somehow resonates that of the Fed, but only to some extent, because the situation is different and the message from the Fed has become a little more, they're thinking about it. I mean, they said we are not even thinking about thinking. Now they have moved one step, they're thinking about. That doesn't seem to be the case for the ECB. But very shortly, I think that the problem of the ECB is deeper than that, in the sense that until 2007, we had a central bank, like in most advanced economies, which had one tool, which was the interest rate, and one objective, which was price stability. Now we have a central bank in Europe, but also in the United States, in Japan, in the UK, which has a host of objectives. I mean, they do care about the resource allocation. They do care about income distribution. The border between fiscal and monetary policy is totally blurred. They care about the long-term interest rates, either under the form of interest yield curve control or under the form of QE. And they have a host of tools, and they have quantitative easing, they have forward guidance, they have fixed rate full allotment. So the situation has become much more complicated. And I think that the current situation is not so easy to reconcile with the central bank independence, because central bank independence was clear. I mean, we give you an objective, price stability, you have to find the way to do it, and that's it. Now the situation has become much more complicated, and this is not something that a central bank can deal with on its own. I mean, this is something that society has to deal with.
Thank you very much. Extremely insightful and lots of things to think about. Before giving the floor to Marco to comment on that, Oren, let's switch a little bit gears and go back to the other side of the pond, there's after the latest Scottish elections, there's pressure is mounting for another independence referendum. Can you please give us your view on what is going on, what's going to happen in the UK over the next 6 months, 1 year? So what are the prospects for Irish unification? I know you've been working about that, Irish unification, and even Scottish independence. So because that would have a massive impact on Europe and on European Union, obviously.
Yeah, so let me get to that. I'll just respond very quickly to Francesco first, if I can, which is that I'd agree it's exceptionally unlikely, almost inconceivable, that there could be a border between Ireland and the rest of the EU. And I think if Dublin were faced with a choice of that or a border on the island of Ireland, it would choose a border on the island of Ireland. But everything is designed to try to avoid having to make that choice. In terms of where the UK stands, so Brexit is obviously a territorial event externally, but it's also a territorial event within the UK, and has undermined the internal territorial integrity of the UK, both in general ways, but time is running a little short, so let me just focus on each of the 3 devolved jurisdictions in the UK. Wales, you see increase for support for independence there. But I think Welsh independence is close to inconceivable. It's certainly not happening anytime soon. But I think we'll see a more assertively distinct Welsh identity, claims for more powers from Westminster. Scotland, obviously, support for independence was going into the high 50s for a while. It has now sort of settled down to very close to 50-50. I think there's a strong mandate for the Scottish National Party, but I don't think the Westminster government will concede an independence referendum in the near future. So I think we're into a period of stalemate where support for independence hovers around 50%. It's quite possible that a future Labour-led government would agree to a referendum, possibly in return for SNP support in the House of Commons in forming a government. And it's quite possible that Scots could vote for independence. The difficulty for Scottish people is that Brexit increases the reasons why they might want independence, but it also significantly increases the risks and costs of independence. So it makes it a much more difficult choice in ways than it was in 2014. In Northern Ireland, Brexit has contributed to a fragmentation of the vote for the unionist parties, those who support the United Kingdom. You see an emerging body of people who would describe themselves as other, as having no view on whether unification should take place or not, currently happy with the status quo, but their minds might be changeable. It's less of an identitarian thing. Opinion poll evidence varies depending on what survey method you use. So from around 30% support for unification in some surveys into the 40s for Irish unification in other surveys. The difference between Northern Ireland and Scotland is that the British government has to allow a referendum in Northern Ireland if it appears likely that a majority would vote in favour. We're certainly not at that point yet, but depending on how things play out, ironically, if the protocol works well and properly, support for unification will probably stay at current levels. If the protocol doesn't work well or was abandoned, that's likely to increase support for unification, I suspect. So I think 5 years, I'll be a bit more ambitious. You asked for 12 months. I'll give you 5 years and 10 years with heavily asterisked. I think 5 years we're unlikely to see any changes to the territorial makeup of the UK. But on a 10 to 15 year horizon, I wouldn't be surprised if Scotland and Northern Ireland had both left. I wouldn't bet on that happening, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. And certainly the prospect of it is a destabilizing factor within UK politics, even if it doesn't happen.
Thank you very much. We are coming close to the end of our session, but I would like, Marco, would you like to comment on how increasingly difficult it is for the ECB to be perceived as an independent central bank? I mean, you wrote about coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy. So, what is your view from on that matter?
Okay, thank you very much, Nuno. I mean, you put me in trouble because Commission officials, never comment on monetary policy issues, but I will answer anyway. Now, and also because it has come up in the discussions with Daniel, Francesco. Now, I think let me take a bit of a convoluted way, but if you go back to the Maastricht Treaty, the Maastricht architecture, it was based on asymmetric rules on the fiscal side, so proscribing, not prescribing. So you cannot have more than 3%. You're not at 60% unless you come down, with at a certain speed. And monetary policy had one objective. Then it was quantified in somewhat less than 2%, but close to that. Now, these things, this architecture and the two sides of this had one thing in common. It was somewhat the illusion of all this being neutral to social preferences. So basically, I think countries from the north with very developed welfare states, countries from the south with some more poorer welfare state could still join the monetary union the way it was. And it was based also on what Olivier Blanchard called the divine coincidence. If the ECB stays close to the objective, it will automatically close the output gap. So it will be output will be around potential. Fiscal policy behaves, it lets automatic stabilizers play, and everything works fine with what was called at the time negative coordination. Now, the two crises have actually shown that this construction here, it does not work as automatically as that. So there are choices to be made on monetary policy. They have implications for social preferences. I think Francesco listed all sorts of different objectives and different tools. I think I would say very welcoming all this more complex environment. And as to and it is actually recognized, and I think Christine Lagarde, every intervention she makes on the policy mix, she emphasizes the fact that fiscal policy has to come to the fore, and it cannot things cannot be, you cannot overburden monetary policy by with the fiscal policy being actually not deployed enough. And what you can have actually is the paradox of fiscal dominance via excessive fiscal restraint. Because if you do not do enough for fiscal policy to support the economy, so to support also the pursuing price stability, government, the ECB is, back against the wall, and then actually you have fiscal dominance by doing too little instead of the classic theory of doing too much. So I think here this is recognized. So what is going to be key, I think, is we are now pursuing a review of the surveillance, macroeconomic surveillance of the EU, in particular of the Stability and Growth Pact. This has been put on ice after the pandemic. It will be resumed in autumn, so after the summer now. So the review of the Stability Pact rules and macroeconomic surveillance. The ECB has, at the same time, actually around autumn, will have to come up with the conclusion of the monetary policy strategies. Now, these two strategies are clearly institutionally independent ex ante, but they have to be coherent ex post. So that what is going to be, I think, key. I think on the part of the ECB, how many times I've heard, I mean, the Eurogroup over the many years, the suspicion on coordination between monetary and fiscal policies. I think that was, it was a clear, a bit of an infant reaction, and well justified by newness at the time. So preservation of independence of monetary policy. Now I think the ECB monetary policy, the fact of being much more relaxed about the need to have a proper policy mix and a proper interaction between monetary and fiscal policies, I think shows that there is the the coming of age to the of the ECB, and the choices in the forthcoming choices I think are very important. It was mentioned I think Danielle, the fact that we have to put the public debt, especially high public debt, on a downwards trajectory. I think this is absolutely essential at a certain point. The key issue will be when. I think declaring victory too soon would repeat the mistakes of 2010, when the Eurozone had the only double recession compared to the rest of the world. Think what, so where to actually adjust the fiscal policy. And here, I think what we have done with the plans, with the recovery and resilience plans, also on the reform side, indicates what has to be preserved, not what has to be cut. Because in the past, we cut the good spending, we cut investment. This time, it's in the contract with the EU, so you don't cut that. And then there is the how, and here is the interplay between monetary and fiscal, the sequencing on who exit first, and within the monetary policy, what tools to exit first. I have my preferences here, but I'm not going to tell you.
Thank you very much, Marco. I think we have exhausted the time we had for our panel. I'm sure we could keep on going for many years, given the complexity and the interaction of the various topics. But I think Marco gave a very nice summary of most of what is now on the table.